I'm very, very pleased to introduce you to Ken Jenkins, our first speaker. Ken has a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. He also has extensive postgraduate study in psychology. He works in video production, including 9/11 videos, many of them, including David Ray Griffin, Stephen Jones, and Richard Gage, AIA. Ken is the co-founder of the Northern California 9/11 Truth Alliance, and he often produces their annual 9/11 Film Festival. He is co-founder of 911tv.org. Ken started researching 9/11 a week after the event. He has spoken at 7 9/11 conferences and is currently producing the film, The Pentagon Plane Puzzle. So Ken today will explain the history of the Pentagon plane controversy. How did our 9/11 truth movement become so divided on what caused the damage to the Pentagon? What is the origin of this dispute, and why has it lasted so long? By better understanding the how and the why of this issue, we can understand ourselves better and become better truth seekers. Please help me welcome Ken Jenkins.
Hello, and thank you for being here. So today I'm going to, after an introduction, talk about the history, how we got here, and why we're at such an impasse. Why are we stuck here? And solutions, what can we do? So the introduction I'm calling choices, and there are choices that were made prior to 9/11 and choices yet to be made. Today, after an introduction, I'm calling the choice. I'm going to talk about the history of how we got to where we are today. Second, why there's such an impasse, why are we stuck where we are? And third, solutions. What can we do to resolve this impasse? So the introductions I'm calling choices. They're choices that were made prior to 9/11 and choices that we have yet to make. Second, the history. How did we get here? What ideas caused us to believe that no plane hit the Pentagon? Are those ideas valid? And is there any reason to question these ideas? And why the impasse? What factors keep us from considering alternatives to what we believe to be true? What impedes our progress? And with solutions, what steps can help resolve this impasse? And how can we become better truth seekers? But first, my story. For an entire year or so in 2002, I believed that no plane hit the Pentagon, but that instead a missile hit, perhaps a global hawk. Thereafter, I became agnostic because I realized, after arguing with a fellow truth seeker, that I was arguing to be right, not to find the truth. I was convinced I already knew the truth. Over the following years, I continued to research the subject and found myself drifting more towards a large plane strike. It was only about a decade ago that I became more convinced it was indeed a plane, a large airliner that struck the Pentagon. Most of my fellow speakers at this event had a similar change arc of opinion on this subject, but over different timelines. So, for truth-seeking as truth seekers, we must be willing to be wrong in the pursuit of what's right. And we must follow the evidence wherever it leads. And we need to learn to work together more cooperatively. So I found a quote from a recent Project Censored book that I think sets a nice theme for the day. If you don't know of Project Censored, they have been around for decades, and they've been a supporter of 9/11 truth for nearly 2 decades. No group of journalists, analysts, or scholars is beyond reproach. Indeed, it would be folly to think that some of us are never swayed by emotion, and that our beliefs and our politics do not inform our thinking and writing. We too are susceptible to viewing the world through our own lenses. accepted theories, and value systems. It is possible to strive for accuracy in our pursuit of knowledge and truth. That is, to be open to new evidence and new facts, including, if not especially, those that conflict with our current assumptions and preferred ways of understanding the world. Thus, rather than dismissing new evidence out of hand because it does not fit our current existing theories, the challenge we face is to adjust the latter to account for the former, as we seek to expand our knowledge of the world. So I adapted this slide from John Wyndham's presentation, you'll see later today, and we estimate there are roughly 7 different theories about the Pentagon. There's actually variations, so there's probably more than that. And one of the interesting things is that these 7 theories are mutually exclusive, other than number 7, which overlaps with 2 through 6. So only one of them can be right. So whatever we believe happened, it may or may not be one of the only one out of the various theories that's correct. So it kind of behooves us to be a little more open-minded. And by the way, the first theory that came out after 9/11 was a truck bomb. Most people in our movement don't even know that because it's so long ago and it's a long forgotten theory. But for a while, people were arguing for that. And so it shows there's already been a lot of motion with these various theories, and it's kind of evolved from no plane to no plane impact, because people realized with all the eyewitnesses, there must have been a plane of some sort. So we already have been evolving, and we're hoping to keep evolving until we finally converge on something that we can all agree on. And so which of these theories best fit the evidence? The best theory is one that examines all the evidence, explains all the physical observations, accords with most eyewitness accounts, is consistent with all of the other recorded data, including the Pentagon video cameras, the flight data recorder, and the radar data, is consistent with all additional Pentagon evidence, and can meet all reasonable objections. Now, you notice I'm emphasizing the word one, and in one case, most. Those of us that are working on this issue and trying to look at it from a scientific viewpoint are insistent on examining and considering revealing all the available evidence. And it's the one thing that sets us apart from all other existing theories. So one of our associates recently passed away, Frank Legg, and he and I wrote a paper together before his passing. I think it was his last. And I'm going to summarize that very briefly, and it's available on my website. And this is what Kevin Ryan had to say to Frank, about Frank. So this is what the article looks like at my website. You can read it there. And I'm adapting it for today's presentation. 9/11 was a false flag psyop intended to convince the U.S. citizens that 4 planes were hijacked and crashed into iconic targets, including the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The perpetrators, those that designed and implemented 9/11, had a choice. They could use planes, or they could fake it. They could fake planes. The obvious and easy choice is to use planes. So what possible reason would they have to choose to fake even one of the 4 planes? It would have been very difficult to create a convincing illusion of a plane crash because all of the following evidence would have to be faked. The damage trail, which was very long and complex, and in the last 2 seconds, over a dozen objects were hit before the plane hit the side of the Pentagon. They all have to be explained with any theory. A treetop was clipped. 5 light poles were knocked down and damaged. A fence was badly damaged in 2 separate places by the right engine. And inside that fencing, a massive generator trailer was hit hard by the right engine and underside of the right wing. And that bashing in rotated that massive, heavy generator trailer about 45 degrees. That has to be explained. There was, of course, the entrance hole, which turns out to be plenty big to accommodate all the heavy parts of a plane. Inside the Pentagon, there were many bent columns and as well as severed columns, and they were all severed and bent in the same direction, which would be essentially impossible to fake with explosives, but a plane would do exactly that. And as you saw in the clip from the film I'm working on, the Pentagon plane puzzle, there was a lot of plane evidence found at the Pentagon, literally tons of it, and that somehow all of those scraps and pieces would have had to be placed to be discovered afterwards. And then there were 180 eyewitnesses, and the bulk of them do support the large plane theory. There's a few with witnesses, they kind of follow a bell curve, and there's always a few outlier witnesses which will say things that aren't consistent with what actually happened. We know this from many studies. But the bulk of the witnesses in the middle of the bell curve tend to tell what happened. And that's what we see with the 180 witnesses. The FDR was recovered and in working order, and we have the data. And it can be plotted into finding out interesting things like what happened in the last 36 seconds. DNA evidence, the body parts were found within the Pentagon and outside in the AE drive, and identified and matched to the passengers. They couldn't match the hijackers because they didn't have DNA to match it, but everyone else, except for one of the passengers, which was a baby, was identified by their DNA, as well as all the people in the Pentagon that were killed. So, our article concludes, the perpetrators would have had to fake all this damage in a convincing manner while risking the high likelihood that some witnesses would notice and perhaps even document some of this elaborate faking of evidence. What was there to gain from creating an elaborate deception rather than simply crashing a plane? Nothing. Surely a real airliner crash would create the same effect on the public mind as a successful illusion. The perpetrators had everything to lose by faking and nothing to gain. Why not just use a plane? So, more of the history. How did we get here? During most of the last 37 minutes, the lower parts of the building were obscured, the pictures of the building before it fell were obscured by smoke, fires, and fire hose spray. Those fire hose blasts often blocked sight of most or all of the first floor, where most of the damage was done. Witnesses that arrived at the Pentagon right after the plane crash found a scene that seemed odd to them because the plane virtually disappeared into the building. Mostly small, unrecognizable pieces and scraps of the plane parts were found outside on the lawn. And again, this is just in the first minutes and hours after. Most plane crashes happen at much lower speeds than on 9/11. So most plane crashes leave large pieces of plane wreckage. Not so on 9/11, due to the unusually high speed of the plane crashes. The speed increases the energy, and the energy produces the damage. So we have a profoundly different evidence of a plane because they were profoundly different plane crashes. The same thing happened in New York City, where two 767s plowed into the World Trade Center at similar high speeds. Those two planes also disappeared. The difference in the witness responses may be due in part to the fact that the plane at the Pentagon mostly hit the first floor, in contrast to the planes in New York City, which hit the Twin Towers very high up, far from the witnesses on the ground. When those Pentagon witnesses spoke to the news services of their odd observations, some people jumped to the radical conclusion that there was no plane that hit the Pentagon. These stories went out over the API news wires, casting doubt on what hit the Pentagon. So again, this is within the first hours of the event that this idea came into being because of the unusualness of the plane crash. And thus, the no plane meme was born. So it was born literally on the day, and as we'll learn later in my presentation, the first thing you learn about something tends to stick in your mind, and it becomes hard to change your mind after that first initial thing. It's called anchoring, amongst other things. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now, the second meme that was born early on was that the hole was too small. It wouldn't accommodate a large plane. And this is how that happened. These photographs were taken and released a few of them were released early on. And here we see the fire hose obscuring visibility of the entire first floor from this point of view. Here we see another photograph, same thing. You cannot see anything on the first floor. Now here's another picture where we can sort of see, but there's a little less fire hose, but still you can't see too much. But we do, for the first time in this picture, see the small hole in the second floor. And this is the picture that created the meme that the hole was too small, because it got a lot of publicity. So we see here, once again, the small hole in the second floor. This picture was used in the first book that was published on 9/11, titled The Big Lie, and authored by Thierry Masson of France. Many copies were sold in France, and a bit later, English translation versions were sold in the US. And you can see on the left where the photograph on the right that we saw earlier was used in the book. And it's the only picture that was used. And it was used to justify that the hole was too small, but it only shows the hole in the second floor. And it doesn't show the 96-foot hole in the first floor. Now this one photograph, which was not released early, does show half the hole in the first floor, and then the left half of the hole is obscured again by smoke, but not fire hose. So if this picture had come out first instead of the other one, we may never have gotten the meme that the hole was too small. And we know now that it was 96 foot wide on the first floor. So this is the book as it came out in France, and the author, and again up in upper right, the picture where the first floor is obscured. This is two of the English versions. Now, it was actually this book, which was also released in early 2002, and the video that followed or came out with it, that convinced me for a while that the plane didn't hit because the hole was too small and stuff. And this book and video were very influential in the early days of the movement. And the reason is, the first two parts were about the World Trade Center, a whole section on the Twin Towers, and then the first we heard about Building 7, or many of us heard about Building 7, was from this video and book. So it was very influential. But it also included information about the Pentagon. It was based on Thierry Masson's book, with the hole too small meme and the no plane meme. So this is, for me and for many people, where it all started, because prior to that, I didn't know anything about the Pentagon other than the official story. So if you want to know more of the history, there's a great amount of detail in Wayne Costa's 29-minute chapter 2, titled The Endless Plane Debates, How Did We Get Here? And besides Thierry Masson's book, it talks about the videos in plain sight, loose change, early versions, Zero, with the more recent September 11th, the new Pearl Harbor, a witness reporter, Jamie McIntyre, and how his testimony got distorted, plus websites, info cards, and more. In other words, once the meme was planted in our emerging movement, it spread and it became sort of the de facto truth, even though it was based on these initial mistakes, which were not corrected for reasons we'll learn a little later. Okay, so we've been at an impasse now for nearly 2 decades. Why are we stuck here? About a decade ago, I wrote an article for the magazine of the 9/11 truth movement that existed at the time, Global Outlook. It was a fantastic magazine. My article was titled, The Truth is Not Enough, How to Overcome Emotional Barriers to 9/11 Truth. And I outlined resistances that I found that made it difficult for us as a movement to talk to people outside of the movement about 9/11 and what we've discovered it to be, which is a false flag. Other people have spoken similarly, including Fran Scher, and in her multiple articles, far more exhaustive than mine, one of the things she talks about is groupthink, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today. And basically what I'm going to be talking about to help explain the impasse are what are called cognitive biases, which we all have. But the first thing you need to know about biases is that we tend to have a bias against biases. Meaning, we don't like to be told or have to admit that we have biases, because biases sound like saying we're prejudiced. And that's not the kind of bias we're talking and discussing about today. Instead, we're talking about normal brain functions that we all have, and they're often useful. That's why we have them. Many cognitive biases evolved to help early humans survive in a dangerous world full of predators, where we had to be able to make very quick decisions to survive. But quickly made assumptions are often incorrect. After all, we didn't take time for careful consideration. It's more like a knee-jerk reaction than a thoughtful, considered response. The problem is that such quick assumptions can rather quickly evolve into beliefs, and beliefs are hard to change. And beliefs come with biases. And then we can end up with situations like this. And I can admit, I myself have done exactly this, and I'm pretty sure most of the rest are, because again, we all have these biases. This is normal behavior. So, cognitive biases, what are they? Cognitive biases are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality in judgment. They are well studied in psychology and behavioral economics. The reality of these biases is confirmed by extensive, replicable research. Many biases are effects of information processing rules, in other words, mental shortcuts, called heuristics, that the brain uses to produce quick decisions and judgments. Biases have a wide variety of forms. There's literally well over 100 of them, including wishful thinking, which is something we've all heard of, and groupthink. In any situation, multiple biases can be present at the same time. It's not an either or, it's a lot of both and. So the first of the few we're going to talk about today, only 5, again out of hundreds, is called anchoring. It's also called focalism. It's a cognitive bias where an individual relies too heavily on an initial piece of information offered, considered to be the anchor, when making assessments and decisions. Anchoring occurs when, during the decision-making process, an individual relies on an initial piece of information to make subsequent judgments. Once the anchor is set, all future arguments, estimates, etc., are discussed in relation to the anchor. In other words, once the anchor is established, it is operative when interpreting subsequent information. Now, one of the most major and relevant biases we have is called confirmation bias, and there's a lot of information about this on the web. You put that into a search engine, a lot comes up, including what I'm about to show you. Confirmation bias, also called confirmatory bias or my-side bias, is the tendency to search for, favor, interpret, or recall information in a way that confirms one's belief or hypothesis, while giving disproportionately less consideration to alternative possibilities. People display this bias when they gather or remember information selectively, or when they interpret the information in a biased way. The effect is stronger for emotionally charged issues and for deeply entrenched beliefs, both of which apply to the Pentagon question that we're addressing today. People also tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing position. Biased search, interpretation, and memory have been evoked to explain, again, a long list, I'll give you a few examples. Attitude polarization, when a disagreement becomes more extreme even though the different parties are exposed to the same evidence. We got that one. Belief perseverance, when beliefs persist after evidence for them is shown to be false. Primacy effect, this is again similar to anchoring, in irrationally greater reliance on information encountered early in the series. And I showed how the whole too small meme and the no plane meme came in at the very beginning of the series. So those two things persist to this day. People still believe the hole was too small, even though evidence for the 96-foot hole in the first floor has existed for well over a decade. And then there's one called the illusory correlation, when people falsely perceive an association between two events or situations. In other words, connecting dots that don't logically connect. I like to call it connecting too many dots. We want people to connect dots, but sometimes we can connect too many that don't actually connect. Other examples that come from within the grouping of biases that come under the heading of confirmation bias is biased interpretation. Confirmation biases are not limited to the collection of evidence. Even if two individuals have the same information, they can often, the way they interpret it can be biased. Then there's one called disconfirmation bias. People set higher standards of evidence for hypotheses that go against their current beliefs. I hear that often in the movement where we're trying to talk about the plane, and people come back and saying, where's your proof? They don't ask, where's our evidence? They ask, where are proof? So proof is a higher standard. So that's how that one applies. Then there's overconfidence in beliefs. Confirmation biases contribute to overconfidence in personal beliefs and can maintain, even strengthen beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. Wishful thinking. Now this is an interesting one because, again, it's a commonly known thing. This is not new to anyone. And it seems to apply to our movement in ways that are quite significant. Wishful thinking is a cognitive bias that involves what is pleasing and desirable to imagine and have. Wishful thinking often contrasts with approaches formed by evidence, rationality, or reality. Our movement desires and wants evidence and theories that disprove the official story. That's what we're about, right? Disproving the official story. So that's the evidence we want. Wishful thinking would cause us to be biased in favor of any hypothesis or theory that disproves the official story. It would also cause us to resist and push away any hypothesis that is consistent with the official story. And this is another good example where those of us have been working on the Pentagon plane question encounter unusual amounts of resistance and even hostility because our research supports a piece, an element of the official story. And we're often criticized for that when what we're supposed to be doing is looking for the truth. Even worse, our work with the Pentagon plane seems to take away or nullify theories that, if true, would counter the official story. Thus our work, to some, feels like a kind of betrayal, and thus it arouses suspicion towards us. That is hardly a level playing field for truth-seeking. The problem is that our natural biases tilt the playing field. Another one that applies to many things within our movement is this idea of groupthink. And this is one of the ones that Fran Scher has written extensively about. I recommend her work highly. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony and conformity within the group results in irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. Group members try to minimize conflict and reach consensus decision without critical evaluation of alternative viewpoints by actively suppressing dissenting viewpoints, especially when there's isolation from outside forces. And that's where this really applies to us, because as a movement, we have felt alienated, separated, and isolated from everyone outside of our movement that doesn't believe what we believe. We've kind of huddled together and we share information together. Our books and our presentations, this all comes from within the movement. And there's only a few of us that really look at our critics and try to address what they're saying. And this is all part of groupthink. 9/11 Truth Movement is a group, and so this is something we have to consider very seriously. The dysfunctional group dynamics of the in-group produces an illusion of invulnerability, an inflated certainty that the right decision has been made. Again, this is all from research. Thus, the in-group significantly overrates its own ability in decision-making and significantly underrates the abilities of its opponent, the out-group. And again, we're now talking about groups within the group. So we have these at least 7 different groups that have 7 different beliefs about the Pentagon. And so we have different in-groups representing each point of view, and everyone outside of those, any of the other 6 theories, is the out-group. Furthermore, groupthink can produce dehumanizing actions against the out-group. And again, I mentioned the hostility that we have faced. This conformity of viewpoints within a group does not mainly involve deliberate group decision-making, it might be better explained by the collective confirmation bias of the individual members of the group. In other words, we all come in with our own confirmation bias, and collectively we come to an agreement, which is a form of groupthink. And it may or may not be true. And that's the point. Just because we come to it within our group doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It might be, might not be. And out of that, quite naturally comes something else that you've probably heard of, called the bandwagon effect. It's a phenomenon whereby the rate of uptake of beliefs, ideas, trends increases the more that they have already been adopted by others. As more people come to believe in something, others also jump on the bandwagon, regardless of the underlying evidence. The tendency to follow actions or beliefs of others can occur because individuals derive information from others within the group, particularly within insular groups. And that's the best adjective I know to describe what we are as a movement. We're insular. We're kind of somewhat insulated from the outside world because we experience so much rejection from people outside our group. So, to sum up briefly, we've discussed anchoring, confirmation bias, wishful thinking, groupthink, and the bandwagon effect. Again, just 5 of hundreds that exist, and again, they can all occur at the same time, or any number of them can happen simultaneously. Okay, solutions. The main thing we can do is to learn about and be aware of our biases. When we are conscious of our quite normal cognitive biases that we all have, we can compensate for them and work around them. We can learn to disagree in a more constructive way. Again, part of working together. And I'm going to talk about these last 3 after I list them. Third, we can beware of one-word explanations for complex situations. And we can use the principles of the scientific method. And I'm not talking about using science, I'm talking about using the scientific method. So let's talk about these 3. First, learning to disagree in a more constructive way. I found this graphic, I think it's very instructive. And the idea with this is to move away from the bottom of the pyramid and move towards the top, because the most dysfunctional and antagonistic and hostile ways of working together are at the bottom, and the ones that actually get us to the truth are at the top. And I'll mention just a few. Beyond name-calling is the very common ad hominem attack, which attacks the characteristics or authority of the writer or speaker without addressing the substance of the argument. And then moving up to the middle, we have contradiction, where instead of discussing the evidence, there's just another point of view presented. And where we want to go towards the top, which is refutation, which finds a mistake and explains why it's mistaken using quotes. And at the best, at the top, is refuting the central point, where we explicitly refute the central point with evidence. So the biggest problem we've had in the movement are ad hominem attacks, which is Latin for to the person. It is a fallacious, argumentative strategy whereby genuine discussion of the topic at hand is avoided by instead attacking the character, the motive, and other attributes of the person making the argument and/or persons associated with the argument, rather than questioning the substance of the argument itself. It's a form of attacking the messenger instead of refuting evidence. And an example of attacking the motive is that we have been criticized because we're supporting the official story. Well, if some of the official story is true, and most of us believe planes hit the Twin Towers, then looking into the question of if it was also a plane at the Pentagon is that's the evidence that we're trying to talk about. And questioning our motive, because it happens to be part of the official story, is an ad hominem attack. We are presenting evidence, and that supports truth-seeking. Okay, beware of one-word explanations for complex situations and damage. And from what you've seen and know already, and what you'll be seeing more of today, the kind of damage that occurred at the Pentagon and what happened is very complex. And the one-word explanations we get for the evidence, some of the evidence we present, is that it was faked, or planted, or staged. Kind of three variations of the same. But it's like that explains it. You know, how did those light poles get knocked down? Oh, they were planted. One word. Or it was all done with explosives or bombs. Well, creating all this very complex evidence with explosives would be extremely difficult, and in some cases literally impossible. So one-word explanations cannot explain it all. And then there's the ubiquitous Photoshop for all the photographs that, well, you know, they're not trustworthy sort of Photoshop. Well, yes, Photoshopping can occur, but, you know, we have to look at beyond that one-word explanation and ask, well, was it Photoshopped, and not assume. And finally, the principles of the scientific method is an empirical method of acquiring knowledge. It involves careful observation, applying rigorous skepticism about what is observed, given that cognitive assumptions can distort how one interprets the observation. It involves formulating hypotheses via induction based on such observations, experimental and measurement-based testing of the deductions drawn from the hypothesis, and refinement or elimination of the hypothesis based on what was learned from the experimental findings. These are the principles of the scientific method. And again, it doesn't have to be science, it's just looking at evidence in a systematic way, in a method. So, summing up, solutions, what can we do? We can learn to be aware of our biases. When we're conscious of our quite normal biases, we can compensate for them and work around them. Learn to disagree in more constructive ways, where we talk about evidence rather than attacking things like motives. Be aware of one-word explanations for complex situations, and use the principles of the scientific method. Thank you very much.